The first thing Ambassador Thessaly Vorn did when she met me was laugh. It wasn't cruel, exactly. The Valori don't really do cruel. They're too refined for it, too careful with their words and their postures, and their six-limbed gestures that mean 17 different things depending on which joint moves first. No, her laugh was the kind you give a child who shows up to a sword fight carrying a stick. Polite, musical, completely dismissive. I stood in the embarkation bay of Station Aurum and let her look me over. She tilted her long head to one side, her amber eyes moving from my boots to my face in the careful, measuring way her species has, and then she said to her aide, Calyx, in a voice just quiet enough to be technically private, "Is this the protection unit?" Calyx confirmed that yes, I was. She smiled. The Valori version of it, which involves a subtle brightening of the skin around the cheekbones, and said nothing more. But the laugh had already done the work. I'd heard it. She knew I'd heard it. And she said nothing, because in her world, nothing needed to be said. I was a small, soft-skinned creature from a minor species, assigned to protect one of the most important diplomatic voices in the conclave of 12 worlds. The comedy spoke for itself. I picked up her travel case and followed her to the cruiser. That was 3 months ago. A lot has changed since then. Let me tell you what the Galactic Diplomatic Corps briefing packet said about the Valori, because I read it twice on the transit flight, and I think it's important context. It said they were elegant. It said they were extraordinarily gifted communicators. It said their homeworld, Vel Prime, had a gravity of about 60% of Earth standard, a stable climate that hadn't changed significantly in 10,000 years, and no apex predators remaining in the wild. Every dangerous animal on their planet had been either domesticated or carefully relocated to protected reserves centuries ago. They had not fought a war in 400 years. They lived, on average, 3 times longer than humans, and they thought of danger the way most people think of a word in a language they studied briefly in school, something they understood in theory, but had never really needed to use. I grew up in northern Montana. I want to be clear about what that means. I grew up in a place where the winters could freeze exposed skin in under 8 minutes, where grizzly bears occasionally walked through the yard, where my father taught me at age 7 that if you encounter a mountain lion you do not run, you make yourself big, you make noise, and you do not look away. I joined the military at 18. I did things in places I'm not permitted to name for people who couldn't officially acknowledge I was there. I came back from those places with a partially reinforced skeleton, a subdermal clotting mesh woven through my major muscle groups, and a recalibrated relationship with pain that my core physician described, clinically, as aggressive. I am not a dramatic person. I don't say any of this to impress anyone. I say it because when Thessaly laughed at me in that embarkation bay, she wasn't laughing at me specifically. She was laughing at what she thought I was. And she thought I was fragile, because from where she was standing, I looked it. She had no way of knowing what I was made of yet. The conclave dinner on the first night of the summit was the kind of event that makes you understand why diplomatic security is genuinely difficult work. 300 beings from 12 species in a single room, most of them valuable, many of them with enemies, all of them in formal attire that makes it nearly impossible to read body language correctly. I stood behind Thessaly's left shoulder and spent the evening watching everything except the people I was supposed to be talking to, because that is the job. The other guards were remarkable, by most standards. Grivosh, who was assigned to the Krath delegation, stood close to 2.5 meters tall and was built like something that had been assembled specifically to end arguments. He looked at me across the room early in the evening with the particular expression that large beings from powerful species use when they are deciding whether a smaller creature is worth acknowledging. He decided I wasn't, mostly, but he came over anyway during the pre-dinner reception and asked me, in trade tongue, what exactly I was planning to guard Thessaly with. Intention, I said. He stared at me. I smiled at him. He walked away. The shooting started 40 minutes later. It wasn't aimed at our table. The target was the Delvari ambassador, across the room and 2 levels up on the mezzanine level, which told me the shooter had a position with elevation. The sound was suppressed but not perfectly, which told me the weapon was modified but not professional grade. The chaos that followed was immediate and total. Beings of 11 different species reacted in 11 different ways, most of them involving noise and movement in too many directions. I moved before the noise started. Thessaly was behind the load-bearing pillar to our left before she had processed what the sound was. I had already identified the shooter's probable angle from the entry wound location on the Delvari ambassador, who was injured but alive, and relayed coordinates to station security through the comm unit in my collar. I had a weapon in my hand that nobody in the room had known I was carrying because the diplomatic corps has specific clearances for specific personnel, and I am specific personnel. 4 seconds, start to finish. Gravash was still getting to his feet when I looked back across the room. I put the weapon away, checked Thessaly for any sign of injury, and said, "Are you all right, Ambassador?" She looked at me for a long moment. Her antenna, the small, expressive filaments above her ears that the Valori use to communicate emotional states they consider too personal to voice, were standing completely still. In Valori body language, that means something has happened that requires complete recalibration. "Yes," she said quietly. "I'm fine. Good." I moved back to my position, 3 paces behind her left shoulder, hands clasped. She didn't laugh again that evening. She started asking me questions on the transit to the next system. I didn't mind. Questions are better than assumptions, and I'd had enough of the assumptions. She asked about my augmentations. I told her, plainly, what had been done and why. She listened with the careful, full-body attention that Valori give to things that matter to them, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment before she said, "You allowed someone to modify your skeleton." "Yes." "Because you wanted to be more effective." "Yes." She looked at me the way you look at a piece of mathematics that is technically correct, but emotionally difficult to accept. Then she asked about Earth. I told her about it the way I'd tell anyone, without drama, because it isn't dramatic to me, it's just home. I told her about the weather systems, which have grown more intense every decade, and now regularly produce events that have required the creation of new classification categories. I told her about the deep ocean, which we have explored less thoroughly than the surface of several other planets, and which continues, reliably, to produce discoveries that are unsettling. I told her about the gravity, one full standard unit, which is meaningfully higher than the galactic average, which means that every human being alive develops their skeletal structure under constant, significant compression, which is part of why we tend to be denser than species from more comfortable worlds. I told her about the bacteria, almost as an afterthought, because I'd nearly forgotten to mention it, and Calyx, who was listening from the doorway, made a very small sound when I did. "And your species evolved there," Thessaly said. It wasn't quite a question. "Nothing was going to do it for us," I said. She looked out the viewport at the stars for a while after that. I went back to checking the corridor feeds on my wrist unit, because the transit wasn't as quiet as it appeared, and I had 3 potential concerns I was still evaluating. But I noticed that she didn't call for Calyx, didn't begin drafting correspondence, didn't do any of the dozen things she usually filled her quiet moments with. She just sat and thought. I took that as a good sign. Reth 4 was where things became serious. The meeting was supposed to be a routine border mediation. 4 parties, 1 contested resource corridor, a morning of structured negotiation, and an afternoon of careful social diplomacy over a meal. I'd read the threat assessment twice, and flagged 2 concerns that the core analyst had rated low probability. I always flag the low probability concerns. In my experience, low probability is another way of saying, we haven't seen this happen recently, which is a very different thing from, this cannot happen. The informant reached us through a back-channel contact of Thessaly's 40 minutes into the session. Pressure-sensitive charges, building-wide. Someone had spent considerable time and resources on this, which meant it wasn't impulsive, which meant there were likely additional elements we hadn't identified yet. I did not share all of this with Thessaly. I shared the part she needed, which was, we needed to leave now, through a specific route, without stopping. "Stay behind my left shoulder," I told her. "Don't stop walking. Don't look back." She nodded once. She is, whatever else I might say, genuinely excellent at following clear instructions under pressure. That matters more than people realize. The first corridor was fine. The second was blocked by a Covenant soldier who stepped out from a maintenance access point with a weapon and a very confident expression. He ordered us to halt in 3 languages, which suggested he'd been briefed on our delegation's composition and considered himself prepared. He was not prepared. I don't describe what happened next, not because it was complicated, it wasn't, but because it doesn't need describing. Thessaly saw the result. That was sufficient. The third corridor had experienced a partial ceiling failure, live conduit exposed. Smoke from something burning in the infrastructure above us. Most species threat assessments would have recommended an alternate route. There was no alternate route. I told Thessaly to cover her face, went first, and moved through it. Because that is what you do. You go first. You go toward the thing, rather than away from it. Because waiting on the other side of a problem doesn't make the problem smaller, it just makes your options fewer. We reached the extraction shuttle. I got her inside. I turned around because I hadn't seen Calyx come through behind us, and I did the math very quickly and went back in. He was 40 meters back, pinned under a section of collapsed ceiling panel. He was conscious, but couldn't move, and was making the particular sound that beings make when they are trying very hard not to panic, and not entirely succeeding. I moved the panel. I picked him up. I carried him out. The laceration on my forearm from the conduit housing was bleeding in the cheerful, committed way that arm wounds tend to, and Thessaly pointed at it when I got Calyx into the shuttle and said, with significant alarm, that I was injured. I looked at it. "It's not the bone," I said. "I'm fine." She stared at me with her antenna fully upright, which in Valori means something between disbelief and a kind of wondering that doesn't have a direct translation. I sealed the shuttle door. We left Reth 4. She dismissed the medic in the bay afterward and sat across from me while my arm was treated. I let her. She was quiet for a long time, which is unusual for her. Thessaly is a diplomat, which means she is almost never without words. Then she asked if I had been afraid. "Yes," I said, "but you went back." "That's the whole thing," I told her. "Being afraid and going anyway. That's what it is." She thought about that for a long time. Then she told me she had laughed when she first saw me, and that she wanted to apologize. I told her it wasn't necessary. She hadn't known. She nodded slowly, and asked what Earth was really like, in a way that suggested she meant something deeper than geography. I leaned back, and looked at the ceiling, and thought about Montana, about the weight of the air in winter, about my father's voice telling me not to run, about every place I'd been sent to that wasn't on any official map, and every moment I'd stood in the dark with the knowledge that nothing was coming to help me, and I would have to manage it myself. "You don't know you're different," I said, "until you leave." I thought that was just what living felt like. Turns out it isn't, not for most. She was quiet, then very softly. "It sounds exhausting." "It is," I said. "I still miss it every day." At the emergency conclave session, Warlord Thresh of the Unbound Covenant stood before 12 worlds, and called the Valori soft. He gestured at Thessaly and said that her kind hid behind process and diplomacy because they lacked the fundamental capacity for strength. Thessaly rose. She spoke the way she always does, with precision, with grace, with the kind of language that sounds like it was constructed rather than spoken. She described Reth 4th. She described every moment of it, factually and completely. And then she said something that I understand has since been entered into the Conclave's permanent record. She said that I came from a planet where survival had never been given, only earned. That my species had built an interstellar civilization, not because the universe made it easy, but because we were constitutionally incapable of accepting that it wouldn't. That Thresh had looked at me and seen something small and soft and forgettable, and that this was the most significant tactical error anyone in that room had made in recent memory. Every camera turned to me. I stood at parade rest. I looked at Thresh. He looked at me. He is a being who has conquered 3 systems through force. He has, by any reasonable measure, seen genuinely dangerous things. But there is something particular about being looked at by a human who has decided to be patient. Something that I have heard described, by people who study these things, as uniquely unsettling. We are the species that waits. We are the species that came from a place that never stopped trying to end us, and simply kept going anyway. When we look at something calmly, it is not because we are unafraid. It is because we have already had the conversation with ourselves about what happens next, and we are comfortable with the answer. Thresh looked away first. He sat down. The vote was unanimous. On the cruiser afterward, Thessaly asked if I would request reassignment now that I had earned a more prominent post. "No," I said. She looked up from her correspondence. "Why?" "I thought about it. You're good at the thing I'm not good at. I'm good at the thing you're not good at." "That's a reasonable arrangement." She laughed. "It was different this time. Nothing like wind chimes, nothing like dismissal. It was warm and real, and a little tired, the laugh of someone who has had a genuinely difficult week and found something in it worth appreciating. I laughed at you, she said, mostly to herself. You didn't know, I said. Neither did I. About you. That's how it starts. She looked at me for a moment. Then she went back to her correspondence, and I went back to watching the corridor feeds, and the cruiser moved through the dark between stars, with both of us doing the work we were built for. That, as far as I'm concerned, is how it should be.